86. Altar versus Pulpit. Chalcedon Position Paper number 172, February 1994. In a study marked by a rather harsh dislike for the Puritans, Hugh Trevor Roper, in Catholics, Anglicans and Puritans, 1987, makes a very important and decisive point in describing the developments within the Church of England. The different parties began as one, with a common allegiance to the Anglican Church and its order. They then divided sharply and bitterly. In time, Archbishop Laud became a hard and persecuting prelate, and the Puritans were later to manifest a strong desire to dismantle a church they had long loved. These Puritans were Church of England Puritans, strongly wedded to the establishment and its heritage. They were alike given to a tracing of and a love for the Old English Church before the Norman Conquest and before the Council of Whitby. Why did they divide? And what was the root cause of the difference? According to Trevor Roper, it was a clash between the primacy of the altar as against the primacy of the pulpit. In the Church of England, to the Arminian as to the Catholic, the pulpit was a utilitarian feature, secondary to the altar, which was invested with an aura of mystery. To the Calvinist, the order was reversed. The function of the church was preaching. The altar was the utilitarian feature. Page 94. Laud said, on one occasion to William Pyrrhon, "The altar is the greatest place of God's residence on earth, greater than the pulpit. For there, 'tis at most hoc est corpus meum, this is my body, but in the other it is at most hoc est verbum meum, this is my word." Page 94. Well before Cromwell's army, the hostilities broke in violence to opposing chapels. Parliament, in 1643, authorised a campaign against images under the authority of the Earl of Manchester, whose men arrived at Cambridge to purge its chapels of image. They worked with hammers, saws and other instruments to smash the Laudian editions. Both parties had begun with a common loyalty to the Church of England and a common faith. They parted company on the priority of altar or pulpit. The fathers in faith of the altar party were men like Erasmus, Gotius, and Arminius, men who rejected the priority of the word over the altar. Their theologies were inclined to be vague at points and tolerant of much. Thus, the altar party was often accused of Socinianism, Unitarianism, even though they were Trinitarian. The reason being their toleration of differing theologies, but no toleration of any hostility to their high church sacramentalism. They liked Socinian's rationalism more than they did the theological precision of the Calvinists. The altar party moved into a theological toleration, but became fanatical about gowns, candles, bowing to the altar and more. On such issues, they at times put the Puritans to shame with their zeal. The Church Puritans at times treated the Lord's table with studied indifference. Any table would do, and it could be stored out of sight when not used. Their churches were, to the altar party, unclean and disorderly. Both sides used intense rhetoric and physical force. The altar party's force was used against people. Both had their triumphs, and both paid a heavy price for their victories. And the Church of England declined in its power and relevance. But the controversy was important. Ideas do have consequences, and often beyond the scope of our vision. The altar party did not win. It was simply favoured by Charles II, whose private preference was Rome, if one could say he had any loyalty beyond pleasure and his mistresses. The altar party commanded the church, but gradually lost the nation. Its subsequent stance, besides deism, was high church, broad church, and low church. All three positions have reference to the altar and to the church's clerical parties. Where the nation and its people were concerned, it was marginally relevant, and today is inconsequential. The pulpit party, like the altar party, never looked beyond its struggle with the opposition to see its place in the life of England. Both parties had seen their position as the truth of God. Neither had confronted the fact that they did not respect what the people of England wanted. Of course, what God wants is most important, but how could they minister to the people as a victorious political party? The true altar party after 1688 was the non-juror group, and none was more irrelevant. The continuing church was made up of the politically expedient clergy. The Church Puritans were, in part, the winning party in the Civil War, but they demonstrated, as had Laud earlier, that victory on their terms was something the nation could not grant. Cromwell had to stand against them. After Cromwell's death, the Church Puritans, the Presbyterians, were the ones who brought back Charles II in 1660, who then ejected them from the church in 1662. Both the altar and the pulpit party had struggled to control a state establishment, so that theirs was a struggle for power, not a mission. The states, in time, would only allow a church that, for many years, was not allowed a convocation until it was incapable of any independence. They had begun with a common loyalty and starting point. Their presuppositions drove them in different directions. Non-Anglican Arminians drifted away from the altar faith to stress what was implicit in their position from the beginning, an emphasis on the freedom of man from God's sovereign power, on free will as against sovereign grace. Ironically, the pulpit party, the English Presbyterians, drifted into the error they accused the altar party of, Socinianism. Both groups had erred seriously in having a church focus instead of a faith focus. The institution came to mean more to them than the faith and the Lord that it was supposed to represent. They therefore betrayed both the pulpit and the altar. We live in the consequences of their failure. The beautiful altars and pulpits remain, but their meaning is gone. It is time to bring back the King. 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 10.